necessarily say about that. Like they're not like, don't be boastful or don't be proud. Like that's not really a Psalms tradition as much, or a Proverbs tradition as much, a wisdom tradition from the Old Testament. But the way Jesus talks about it sometimes is within, not in the content, but the form is like a wisdom saying. What I mean is this. Jesus tells a story. He says, when you go and you have a banquet, don't put yourself at the head of the table. Now, why not? Because that's just wrong of you to do that. Because you just shouldn't be like that. Because you're violating a value or something like that. Is that why Jesus says not to do that? I mean, those things are probably implied, but what's the actual reason Jesus says to not put yourself at the head of the table?
To be a better host.
No. Let's see, what was that? We're in Luke 14, is that right?
You'll
So
be
you know,
food.
huh?
They decide you're the big food.
Yeah, that's right. That's what Jesus says. He says, if you do that, if you go and you take the best seat at the table when you show up at the dinner party, the host might come in and say, now you're talking about who you invite.
I thought you said when you throw it.
No. When you go to the dinner party and you take the best seat, right? That's the part that I'm talking about, right? Why don't you do that? Because the host may come here and say, you're not on the A list, you're more like a D lister. Why don't you give up that seat and go back down to the bottom of the table, okay? And on the other hand, if you go and you take the worst seat at the table, the host might come in and say, oh man, brother, you deserve to be up here. Come on up here and sit up here at the head of the table with all the fancy folks, okay? Get real bougie, as the kids say. I don't know, the kids say that, Caroline? No? Yeah, okay, they do, good. So, you guys see what Jesus is teaching there is it's in a wisdom mold, right? Avoid this kind of behavior because it will lead to your humiliation, right? Like look down, see how this is going to play out, and act accordingly. And if you alternatively act in a way that kind of debases yourself, well, somebody else will do the work of exalting you and vindicate you, right? And that's a way of Jesus saying, you're just looking at the consequences of what's likely going to happen. And wisdom, the whole field of wisdom, is about being able to look at what's happening in life, being able to choose a path based on both what you've learned from your experience and from what you see in the present, and what is likely to happen in the future. Right? That's what wise people do. Wise people learn from what's happened, they look at what's going on right now, and then they make a choice based on what's probably going to take place as a result of their actions. That's what wisdom is. Okay? Now, foolishness is the opposite. Right? What do fools do? Well, fools choose what they want in the moment, ignorant of what's really taken place in the past, okay? And without any kind of real sense about what's really going to happen in the future. And I'll tell you, when you talk to somebody that is just, have you ever talked to somebody and it's just clear they don't have an accurate sense of like the way things are going to go? You ever talk to somebody and you're like, and they're sure that like, spending their last dollar on this new car is like the best way to handle things, right? And you're going, maybe hold a little bit back from the next month's rent, okay? Like, you can kind of see, I mean, foolishness to a wise person looks like a train wreck about to happen, okay? I think that's a great way of distinguishing the two fields, okay? Sometimes Jesus teaches in that mode of a sage, of a person teaching with wisdom. All right? You guys with me? All right. There are other times where Jesus teaches not in the mode of a sage, but in the mode of a prophet. Okay? Now, prophets, we often think of them as like future tellers, okay? They foresee things that are going to happen. And in that way, prophets have kind of a unique sort of wisdom, right? Like they have special insight into what's coming, and so that creates a different way of making a decision in the present. So when prophets have that kind of special insight of what God's going to do in the future, that changes things a little bit. But the real nature of a prophet for Israel was not necessarily in just pointing out what was going to happen in the future, but it was about pointing out what was important in the present. The prophets are more concerned with values than they are with wisdom. Let me say that again, because that may not resonate really well. Okay? But a prophet is more concerned with values than they are with wisdom. Now, it turns out for true prophets that their prophecies have kind of a hidden wisdom that's that couldn't be perceived by somebody else. Okay, except for by insight from God. But a prophet will often speak about things that seem counterintuitive to the sage. Okay? So we have a prophet might speak, for instance, about the importance of pursuing justice. Well, justice is only wise if you take a really long view and expect God to act in the future. Like, just in terms of human standards, do what you want, do what you want to do, and take what you want to take. Okay? Amass as much power and use it in whatever way it benefits you as best you can. Okay? Like, wisdom doesn't necessarily interfere with that, except for trusting that God is going to act at some point in the future and rectify and vindicate that stuff. Okay? Or if we want to think about it, Jesus, we're finally ready to talk about the category of teachings that Jesus has to show us. And I want us to turn to Luke chapter 12. You ready? Okay, great. Because this is going to illustrate the difference better than I think me just talking about it abstractly would. All right. So in Luke chapter 12, there is a moment where Jesus is teaching to a crowd. And somebody in the crowd, knowing that Jesus is on the side of justice and knowing that Jesus often will intervene and speak up, for people that are on the outs or who have been done wrong, this guy says in verse 13, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." Now, we don't get any more context from that. So, who knows what his brother was actually doing to him. Was his brother actually doing something that was wrong, or was he just kind of following the guidelines? This guy wanted a bigger piece of the pie. We don't really know exactly what's going on in that family situation, and Jesus does not press him for details. Jesus doesn't say, okay, tell me everything that you want to do. All right? Jesus says something similar to what I often tell my kids when they come and they tell me some massive grievance that one of their siblings has foisted upon them. And I've had this conversation so many times. I really hope that someday it will stick. I don't really expect it to, but hope springs eternal. I will tell my child, because they've told me something, and there's no way I really know. Like, they're both telling me, and I'll say, guys, I'm not going to hold court. Okay? I'm not going to, be a detective and get a magnifying glass out there and go look for clues and try to figure out, who really exactly dropped that piece of paper outside, or who actually took the other person's Chick-fil-A toy. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to get into, we're not going to hold witnesses, and have evidence. And so I just want, the only way this really resolves is that at some point, you guys just decide to say, oh, okay, whatever, go and leave me alone. just go do something else, right? And there's no other solution to this. This never ends unless I decide to just punish you both and everybody's upset. So we can either fight about it for the next 20 minutes and then do that, or we can just go ahead and say now, okay, whatever, and just go along our ways. What do you guys want to do, right? And Jesus says to this guy in Luke chapter 12, what's his response. I find it to be like really dismissive. What does he say? Somebody read it to me.
Man who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you.
Yeah, he says, man, why are you bringing me into this? Right? I mean, I really feel like that's exactly the kind of thing that I like telling my kids, like, guys, just work this out yourselves. You know, like I don't need to be a part of this conversation. All right, but then we get this jewel. Ray, go on, read that next little bit.
Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions.
Okay, and you guys have all heard this phrase for a long time, and it might not have sunk in how just patently foolish that saying is on its face. Right? Like, your life does not consist in the abundance of its possessions. I know that there's some wisdom to that, but you gotta travel a path before you get to the wisdom that's there. Okay? I mean, if you think that your life does not consist in the things you have, well then, live for a day without any of them. Okay? And you'll say, well, I'm not sure that this is the life I'd really sign on for. Right? This is not the kind of thing that you can throw out to somebody who is impoverished or struggling for food or like trying to figure out where they're going to stay the next day. You don't just pat the homeless person on the shoulder and say, well, lucky you that life isn't about possessions. That would be like a terrible thing to say to somebody, wouldn't it? Right? We all intuitively know that. Let's think about that as we read the story, okay? And I want you to tell me if it contains a sort of foolishness to it, right? He told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. And then he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. All right, now let's just pretend that this story stopped right there. And you guys are telling me that if somebody in our church said that this was going to be, like this was their situation, they had a great year, they made more than they normally would have, and they're going to put it all into their retirement fund, and they're going to make sure that they've got enough for the future. And y'all can tell me with a straight face, you would look at somebody that said that and said, you fool. Really? Does that sound foolish? Is this foolish? Now, I know we're all trapped because you can read the next line, okay? But in general human wisdom, is this foolish? Okay? Because what are these guys' alternatives? What else should he do in this situation? Like, just let the grain rot out. Okay, man, we got a grain expert. Okay, Lou. Lou's a grain expert, everybody. I mean, what's he supposed to do with this stuff? I mean, not just, like, it seems like he's just solving a practical problem, isn't he?
Would he have been foolish if he had filled his old barns and given the rest away?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very generous interpretation of what somebody else should do with their stuff. But yes, I mean, I see the point, absolutely, right? But I think we're putting something pretty radical onto the story at that point, right? I mean, I agree. I think maybe that's the point of the story, okay? But I'm saying that's a very different, radical kind of interpretation than what we would normally take. Fred?
I was going to say what he should do is spend the money and take his old poor friends to Alabama football games.
Hey, there are lots of guys like that. And actually, there's another parable that Jesus tells that where
They
somebody...
won't have money to save.
the brothers down south, but we'll talk about that, another day. There is something what is this guy supposed to do? Like, if you just look from a wisdom perspective of this guy's story, of just doing what all of us would admit in most contexts, if you changed around the details of this story so it didn't sound like this parable, and you didn't know you were like reading the Bible, this guy is doing the wise thing. Am I out on a limb there? Right? I'm telling you, this is what I would tell my kids to do. Oh man, you got that? You need to make sure to save some of that extra stuff. Make that path to retirement a little bit easier. Probably, in fact, if you don't do it, you probably will wish you did later. Right? In fact, not doing it would look foolish. That's what foolishness looks like. So Jesus isn't speaking here in the classical mode. Like, the book of Proverbs doesn't tell this story this way. The way Proverbs would tell the story is the wise man understands that when there is a bumper crop, that he should put some aside for the next day. Consider the sluggard that takes it. Right? Like, this is the space. So
Isn't this
yeah.
what they did when the drought and the famine came to Egypt?
The Egyptian story, that's exactly, you were thinking about the same, well, I thought about that a second ago too. Yeah, y'all are on.
That's what Joseph did.
It's what Joseph did, yeah. And what Joseph is directed to do and gains renown and is rewarded for it for the sake of the whole nation. I'm telling you, this is one of those things that if you read it in the Bible because you've heard it 1,000 times as you were growing up and as you lived in, but you kind of look back at the story and it's like, oh, but what? What? What's going on? What's going on with this story? All right, here's the key. You got to understand that there are times when Jesus speaks in the wisdom tradition, and there are times that he speaks in the prophetic tradition. When he speaks in the prophetic tradition, okay, he's not speaking about natural consequences. He's talking about divine values. Divine values, okay? And when he does that, Jesus often says things and seems to delight in saying things that are counterintuitive to natural consequential wisdom. Right? Exactly. Okay. I wish that would happen every time I made it. Just a great point. Okay. We could probably rig something up, right, Bob? Okay, sure. Yeah. Let's think a little bit. Let's unpack this story just a little bit more. Let's read a little bit further. So what does God say? God says, "You fool." Wow, it's a really surprising, not just statement, not just like you wicked person or you selfish person, right? It says you're a fool. What? To it, right? Let's really get into it because if we think about this in a wisdom foolishness paradigm, it doesn't seem that foolish, really. This very night, your life is demanded of you, and the things that you've prepared, whose will they be? Okay? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves but are not rich towards God. All right. May I remind you of the context of the story a little bit? What was the issue that the person who asked the question of Jesus, what was the issue that they had trouble with? What was it?
Their brother.
Yeah, it was dividing inheritance, right? So, which I think is part of the little wry humor of Jesus in this story, because the answer to this guy's question, God's question to the man, might just be your sons who are going to fight over it after you're dead. Okay. In fact, maybe as Jesus is telling this story about an inheritance that has come to a brother, he's thinking about how that wealth may or may not have served his father, who has apparently recently died. Right? And isn't that part of a layer of this story? If you're the person who's come and questioned Jesus over this inheritance, and Jesus tells you a story about someone who surprisingly suddenly dies and is asked, okay, who's going to get your stuff? Don't you think that lands home a little bit? I think that's a reasonable way of reading some of this story. Beyond that, if we kind of if we peel it back just a little bit more, okay. There's one more dimension of this story that I think is worth calling kind of the wisdom stuff into question a little bit, right? Wisdom says, the wisdom tradition, the Proverbs and all this kind of stuff, say that if you follow these wise courses of action, what will happen? You're going to end up like the tree in Psalm 1, which we said was like what? What is it? What are the descriptions?
Fruitful.
It's fruitful and flourishing, right? Okay. In fact, it seems like the kind of thing that would, like, if you wanted to say it a different way, like, you know, if you do the wise stuff, then you're going to end up in a situation where your land will produce abundantly. In fact, that first thing that that we hear in this parable, that there was a man whose land produced an abundant crop, like that sounds like that's the beginning of this story, but it sounds like the end of another story. It sounds like the end of something like Job, okay, where a wise person endures and they receive like the blessing of that, right? Like they have this fruitful crop. And here Jesus says, well, that's kind of like the starting point. Okay, the starting point of this story is moving from abundance through this like plan to kind of acquire that will eventually be kind of pulled apart. What value is Jesus speaking to? Jesus seems to be speaking about what is it that he says the whole crowd before? He says, be on watch against every form of what? Greed. Okay? And then he says that line, a person's life does not consist in the abundance of their possessions. Now, there are a lot of, I'll get to you in just a second, Andrea. There are a lot of people now that would accept that as like, yeah, man, your life is about more than your possessions, okay? But like when Jesus is teaching this, I think it's probably a more radical sort of thought. Yeah, Andrea, go ahead.
So, the difference to me with this parable, that we don't know anything about the man.
Right.
But it just seems like he's thinking of himself.
Yeah.
But Joseph didn't do that.
Yeah.
He was he was storing extra stuff, but it was for the community.
Uh-huh.
Because, right, this man is like, what am I gonna do?
Yeah.
Well, I'll just eat, drink, and be merry or whatever. Like, he's thinking of himself is how
Right. Right, yeah. And there is, like Rachel said earlier, there is like an alternative, like if you start thinking about it, like maybe he would have been better off like sharing some of the abundance of what he had, being content with. I mean, he already has barns big enough to sustain his own life. Like surely that's what he had built, right? So yeah, you're right, Andrea. Like this guy, like there is a part of this question that's like think about not just what comes to you, but what goes from you, and think about what it means to live in a community outside of it. But Jesus' explicit like definition of what this is about the danger. He says of greed. Okay, he says of greed. Somebody define what greed is for me. Oh, I knew that was going to be a real easy one. Okay. Selfishness.
Love and desire for more.
Wanting more. Okay, a desire for more. I think those are really good.
thinking you're gonna be better off with it than
Yeah.
whatever circumstance you're in presently.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Thinking that you're gonna be better. Yeah, it's about this drive to possess, right? This drive to gain, and I think we can leave it at that. Now, there are a lot of reasons why people have greed in their lives. Okay, where do you think greed comes from? There may be several different answers for this. Where does greed come from?
Self-centeredness.
Okay.
Yes.
let's unpack that. Let's say a little bit more about that, because obviously the way that that's phrased is there's a negative dimension to it, and there is. Okay. Can you frame that in a way that's more positive? Because that's the way we would do it ourselves, right?
What do you think's more positive?
A desire to have better for yourself.
Oh, here you go. Yeah, speak up.
A desire to have better for yourself.
Okay. All right. How about
Improvement.
self-improvement, or self-security, or self-independence, self-sufficiency? All right. Yeah. Okay, Andrea.
Kind of like having something for free that
Go
you
on.
didn't earn.
Yeah.
'Cause I'm thinking-
Greed. Yeah.
That, is it okay if I talk about the man who wanted the inheritance that said divide? Well, maybe that dad left the land for the one son, and this son, other one, wants his brother to divide it with him.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to know what's going on. I really wish we had more details about what was happening in that situation, because we know that they're in their culture and in their law that they had pretty strict inheritance laws. Okay, to who would get what part of the land and what amount in the share. And I think one of the central questions for me that we don't know in this story is the brother following the rules, and this guy is saying, give me more than what's typical because I deserve more, or is the other brother not following the rules and Jesus is asking for him to enforce it?
Right.
Yeah, we
Or,
just don't know.
well, the third one is, the one who received the land may be fine with his brother living on, 2 miles down the road on the same property.
Yeah.
But this other brother just wants it like, okay, that's mine.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like a boundary line.
Yeah, very much so, and particularly if you think about like older forms of kinship, where the brother that has control of the greater share of the property also has greater share of like the power of the family, the influence over the whole. It's not as, it's not like a suburban neighborhood, right? Like they may all be living in the same house, or they may be asking to kind of separate some. There's a lot of questions about that.
But in both stories, the focus is on self, right?
Yeah, that's right.
The first one's, give me what's mine.
Yeah.
Give me my portion. And even on past in the story of the farmer, he credits himself for
Yeah.
being successful, right?
Yeah.
So it's self-driven in both of those.
Yeah.
I mean, I looked it up in the ES, and the heading there, instead of the parable of the rich fool, is the story of the greedy farmer.
Yeah.
And then, instead of saying soul, you have that one goods, he says, self, you've done good.
That's a great
yourself.
translation.
So,
Yeah, this whole thing, it's just counterintuitive. It really is. Okay, but what Jesus is doing is he's striking. Part of the reason he's striking at it is that because while we might resist saying we're self-centered, but somebody that has a sense of like self-preservation, like that's more like a virtue, right? Yeah. Mac's voice is changing a little bit back there. Sound good, brother. You understand? You guys understand what I'm knocking in there, right? And what Jesus is doing is when he counterintuitively is like checking on and speaking in this prophetic kind of mode, he's calling us to question what it is that we actually value, right? And he questions, he leans against. And the prophetic and the wisdom traditions are always they're often in tension. Okay, there's often a tension in it, right? Because the wisdom tradition says, do this because it's good for you. And the prophetic tradition says, it's important to live this way even if you suffer for it. Do right even when it's not good for you. The wisdom tradition says, do this and it'll be the best thing for you. Okay? Now there's a strong impulse in the church. I think it's not been it predates us. We would really like to narrow those two things together. Okay? The prophets don't get in trouble when they only speak in concurrence with the wisdom tradition. They get in trouble when what they say seems foolish. Right? Like that's where the prophets, that's where Jesus kind of is going to run afoul of their power place. Okay? When we think about where this is in the book of Luke, we talked about the Lucan context a couple of weeks ago. I think I have trouble remembering how long things were, but remember us talking about the golden rule as it falls, and we talked about how Luke has this context of everything's going to get reversed. Okay? That reversal theme it's a prophetic theme. Okay? Because when Jesus speaks against people who are empowered or religiously centered or wealthy, and he talks about like the danger of those positions, because there's going to come this reversal, there's going to be this fall. Okay? He's not speaking in a wisdom tradition necessarily. Right? He's speaking against something else. Okay? Or like the Beatitudes, right? If we turn back just a couple of chapters, we read these a few weeks ago. In the ones that are in Luke's version in chapter 6 of the Sermon on the Plain, he looked up to his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you'll be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh." Then he goes on to say, "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep." Okay? All of those are counterintuitive to natural wisdom. Natural wisdom says, design a life where you are wealthy enough to be comfortable, where you have the things that provide for your hunger, okay, and a life that's happy, right? And Jesus says, well, if you got all those things, you're probably in for some trouble. What? Like, it's counterintuitive. Well, you can only interpret this with like a prophetic viewpoint, okay, as those things are only wise if God is going to intervene and flip the script for everybody. That's the only way this looks wise. Okay? Because those things aren't naturally going to invert themselves. That relies on the action of God in the world. When we think about Jesus' speech about greed, okay, and it's going to show up in other forms too, like where he says nobody can serve two masters. He'll love the one, hate the other, or he'll hate the one, love the other. Let's say it that way. Whichever one's good. Says he flips it, okay? No one can serve both God and mammon, or money, right? And he makes other kinds of teachings, like one of the things I would say about Jesus' teachings against greed is that it often shows up paired with something else. Okay? Look in Matthew chapter 23 with him. This is another text that we looked at. We looked at this one when we were looking at Jesus' teachings about hypocrisy. Okay? All right, and you guys remember this kind of teaching, right? Like Jesus is teaching about these religiously proud people, okay, who are not living with integrity. Hypocrisy is what we call all that, right? Like that's what this chapter mostly is about. But look at the way it is for, let's just get down to, let's see how about verse 25, okay? "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed or self-indulgence," right? And there are lots of places that are kind of like this, where Jesus is talking about their love of money, or they're talking about their wealth, or their something like that, and it's actually paired with this kind of, there's kind of an unholy trinity of things that this thing kind of comes up with, okay? So here's one of them. The first one is hypocrisy, In particular, what kind of hypocrisy are we talking about? What kind of crowd is he talking to or critiquing in this? Scribes and Pharisees. So what kind of power do these people have? What domain of life are they?
Religious?
Yeah, they're religious. Yeah, okay. So people that have some sort of religious influence or clout are one. Okay. All right. Another one would be people that just have power. The kings, the Herods, the Pilates, other people that are influencing, living by the sword, okay? Or people who don't have that but are coveting it, right? That's another category of this, okay? So we've got religious, we've got the secular, just like military power kind of thing, all right? And what would be the third of this kind of circle? What's the other kind of power that we see Jesus like criticizing a lot? It's this part of wealth, right? People who have financial power. And of course that goes really well with, we're not surprised to find that if Jesus is going to critique people who have financial power, that often those are the same people who have, like military secular power, okay, or who turn out to have, in his day, religious influence and power too. By the way, for those of you guys that don't know this, one of the crazy things that happens between the testaments, okay, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that about 180 to 70 BC, okay, through that period of time, made like Israel or Judah, specifically Jerusalem and Judah, like really, really unstable, is that they went through this period where like everybody keeps robbing the temple treasury, okay, and the people that want to be the high priest are like bidding on it, and they're going to the secular powers like the Greeks or the Seleucid emperors, like kind of the descendants of the Greeks. They're going to them and basically saying, look, hey, if you'll support me to be the high priest, I can get you some of that money out of the temple. All right? I mean, it is crazy some of the stuff that's happened. Like the stories of that stuff are nuts. And they really do. They promise. And in fact, like several of these guys like lose their lives because they do it, and then they don't show up with the money, and the emperor's like, hey, where's my gold? They kill them. Okay? There's a lot of that. So much so that there was a lot of resentment in the popular crowd, okay, in Israel during Jesus' time. There was a lot of resentment about the goings-ons of the temple and the priests and all that, because they turned out to be power players, and they're trading all this money. Okay, people, that's a bad deal. Okay, so there's a lot of resentment for it. In fact, and one of the other things, you guys know that the temple also kind of functioned like a bank. I mean, not just in the like interchange money, the money changer stuff that Jesus, we all know about that. But you know that like the temple was also the place in Jerusalem where they kept like mortgage records? Did you know that? Yeah. They kept like debt records there. In fact, during one of the rebellions, okay, the Bar Kokhba rebellion that's going to happen just a little bit after Jesus, one of the first things that they do is they rush into the temple and they burn all the financial records, like the common people do. Okay, so there's this like Jesus, when there are reasons why when Jesus talks about this stuff that the priests and the scribes are like, oh, we got to shut this down, and the common people are like, yeah, do some more of that. Okay, like there's like it's like people that got burned by Bernie Madoff, and talk to them about hitting back to the guys on Wall Street, and they're like, yeah, that's right, burn it down. There's a lot of that going on in Jerusalem during the time where Jesus comes. And Jesus speaks about greed. He knows his audience. And some people he's stepping on their toes, and there are other people that are saying, yeah, there are a lot of people that hear this story and they're going, I mean, I ain't never going to have to worry about building a second barn. Okay? And Jesus has a message for them too, and the message is, hey, you better be careful. You better be careful, like, wishing that you were the guy in this story. Don't desire to be the guy in this story. All right, last thing I want to say, and this is because we've talked about a lot of the things that we've done in this class are not just looking at the way that Jesus says these kinds of things, but also like the way his followers kind of deal with it later. And I want to look up several places where just the word greed shows up. We're not going to talk about wealth or riches and that kind of stuff. That shows up plenty of times in the epistles too. In the epistles, you often have these forms, you have these lists of vices. Okay? You guys are familiar with this, right? And they'll say, don't be like the pagans who do da 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 da, and they list like 10 things, right? And sometimes those have a really hard edge to them, and sometimes not. There are a couple of things that are very common to show up on those things. One of them is like sexual sin. Right? Like one of the arguments that I think can be made against like people who would say, sex isn't really that big of a deal in the New Testament is that like, man, that, like some kind of sexual stuff like shows up on a lot of those lists. Like it wasn't just a peripheral non-issue. Like it shows up commonly. Okay, but you might be surprised to hear how frequently greed shows up as one of these vices to be ignored. And it often shows up, there's one particular phrase that shows up a couple times I think you'll be interested to see. Let's start off and let's read in 1 Corinthians and let's look at chapter 6 there. And we're just going to real quickly note these things. We're gonna read in verse 9. And by the way, this is in the context. It's worth noting this is a context that might be sort of similar to the stuff that we're looking at in Luke 12. It's the lawsuit section. Like don't take your brother to court. Instead let's settle this differently. All right. Well, in this section, Paul ends it with a list of things like don't go after these things, right? And this is it, verse 9. Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God. This is what some of you used to be, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord God, the Lord Jesus Christ, and in the Spirit of our God. Okay. Did you notice that like the greedy shows up in this list? Okay. Now if I asked you beforehand what kinds of things are going to show up on these lists of vices, you might have named greed, but I don't know if you would have put it like right in as something that shows up as commonly as it does. Look in Ephesians chapter 4. Or chapter 5, rather, I'm sorry. We're going to read just a few verses at the beginning of Ephesians 5. Start with verse 3. The fornication and impurity of any kind, or greed, must not be even mentioned among you as is proper among the saints. Entirely out of place is obscene, silly, and vulgar talk, but instead let there be thanksgiving. Be sure of this, there is that no fornicator or impure person or one who is greedy, and this phrase is in parentheses for me, but is included, or that no one that is greedy, that is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of God, a kingdom of Christ, or of God. All right. So we have this list of things of like that people that have any kind of inheritance in God's kingdom, right there. In fact, it's mentioned twice, is greed. Okay? And we get this additional little hint in Ephesians that greed is related to idolatry. Now, I don't know about your class. Our class on Sunday morning in here, like that kind of came up. You know how sometimes, you guys had the class on idols last Sunday? Yeah? Right? Yeah? Okay. Reluctant yeses. You guys are thinking about it. Okay, all right, there we go. Well, greed is one of those things that like can put idols in front of us. And remember, when Paul writes that to Ephesus, that has a giant literal pagan temple right in the middle of it. Okay, when this big temple of Artemis there, I mean, he says this is when you're greedy, it's like you are going out to that temple to worship Artemis, right? I mean, that's the connection. Which, by the way, is more connected than you might think, right? Because why do you go pray to Artemis? Because you want her to give you stuff. So there's like some actual practical connection there as well. Look in Colossians. Let's look in Colossians real quick. Colossians chapter 3. We get something kind of similar. Okay, of course, Ephesians and Colossians are very closely tied together. And this section is very similar to what we had in Ephesians 5. Look at verse 5 and following. Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly: fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed. Do you have something after that? Which is idolatry, right? So we get a similar sort of list of things. And it goes on to say, on account of these, the wrath of God is coming on those who are disobedient, right? Now, remember, the first part of this is that Paul is laying on the Colossians, you need to put these things to death. Okay? Put these things on death. Put these things to death because they're kind of like this earthly. They're earthly, he says. Okay? And I think it's just kind of, I don't know, it's striking to me that this is kind of in the list of things that, commonly comes up in the list of things that you gotta like push against, right? When we don't think about this qualification very often, but in Timothy and Titus, in the pastoral epistles, when Paul talks about both deacons and bishops or elders, okay? In both of those lists, one of the things that he says is, don't let them be greedy. Now, I've heard a lot of arguments about what some of those qualifications mean, and a lot of people stewed about it, but I don't know that I've ever heard somebody say, that person can't be a deacon, they're just a greedy turkey. I mean, it never comes up, right? Never comes up. Listen, I saw somebody the other day, and I think this is probably part of why I said it. I saw somebody the other day, I've got to really try to think of who it was. At any rate, they said, in our day, okay, a Christian, or there's this all this stuff about greed, like it's just wrapped out what it means to be like good and holy and righteous to our first century brothers and sisters, right? It's part of Jesus' teachings. I think we have to own up to the fact that for us, it's a little embarrassing. The quote that I heard earlier this week is that for a modern day American Christian, we are more comfortable saying, I am a sinner, than saying, I'm rich. Don't believe that? Try both of those phrases coming out of your mouth and see which one comes out easier. I bet it'll be easier to say I'm a sinner than it would be to say I'm rich. Why is that? To say I'm rich puts us into a particular kind of category of things that Jesus talks about. Sinner can be kind of abstract, right? Just means I've got some like generic, general bad stuff. When you confess, I'm rich, well, you start to get pretty concrete in a hurry, right? Okay, Jesus teaches, the Master teaches, for us to be on guard, to be vigilant, right? To be ready to defend ourselves against all forms of greed. This is the way of Jesus. Let's pray together. Holy God, protect us. Protect us from any form of greed. May our hearts not be deformed by the desire, a corrupt desire to acquire and to covet. God, may we be generous-hearted people who are willing to offer what we have to our neighbors. Father, in whatever abundance you give us, may it become something for your own glory and not just for our own. In Jesus we pray. Amen. Okay.
You have an update on